Blood always smells louder than roasting meat. Alpha King Kalen Blackwood descended into the sweltering, soot-choked kitchens, hunting a treasonous lord, not a mate. Yet, amidst the cruelty, a battered scullery maid's terrified heartbeat caught his legendary focus, harboring a dangerous secret capable of burning his entire kingdom to ash. In the year of our Lord 1244, the fortress city of Oakhaven was a place of brutal winters and even more brutal politics. Nestled beneath the jagged shadows of the Wormtooth Mountains, the castle of the Alpha King was a sprawling behemoth of black iron and weeping stone. Inside, the hierarchy was absolute. At the top sat the pure-blood Lycan lords. At the absolute bottom, suffocating in the soot and grease of the subterranean kitchens, were the unshifted orphans and humans. Isolde Mercer belonged to the ash. At 19, she was an unshifted wolf, a defect in the eyes of the pack, a creature possessing the enhanced senses of her kind, but none of their strength or shifting abilities. Her days were measured by the turn of the roasting spits and the sting of the willow switch. The head chef, a massive, cruel-hearted brute named Garrett Finch, ruled the kitchens like a petty warlord. Finch was a lesser wolf, barred from the royal guard due to a crippled leg from a long-past border skirmish, and he took out his humiliation on the only people he could: the scullery maids. It was the eve of the winter solstice, the most important diplomatic gathering of the decade. Lords from the neighboring riverlands and the high crags were arriving to renew the Silverpine Accords. The kitchen was a chaotic hellscape of shouting cooks, boiling cauldrons of marrow stew, and plucked pheasants. Isolde was on her knees by the main hearth, her hands raw and blistered as she scrubbed the grease from the stone floor with lye soap. Her left eye was swollen shut, the skin around it blooming in mottled shades of violet and sickly yellow. A long, fresh bruise snaked down her right forearm, disappearing beneath the coarse spun wool of her oversized tunic. The injuries were a gift from Garrett the night before. Isolde had made the mistake of defending a younger kitchen boy from Garrett's wrath. The chef had responded by backhanding her with a heavy iron ladle, followed by a vicious kick to her ribs. "Keep your head down, Mercer," whispered Clara, an older maid who was hurriedly chopping winter roots nearby. "If Finch sees you slacking, he'll take the other eye. And pull your sleeve down. The blood is seeping through." Isolde nodded numbly, wincing as she yanked the rough fabric down to her wrist. Every breath was a jagged knife in her chest. She just had to survive the night. Once the feast was over, the kitchens would empty, and she could finally crawl into her straw pallet near the grain silos to rest. But destiny, much like a starving wolf, rarely waits for an invitation. Above them, the heavy oak doors of the lower ward slammed open. A sudden, terrifying silence cascaded through the cavernous kitchen, moving like a physical wave. The shouting ceased. The clatter of iron pots stopped. Even the crackling fires seemed to dim. Alpha King Kalen Blackwood had descended into the bowels of his own castle. Kalen was a man carved from the unforgiving ice of the north. He stood 6'5", his shoulders broad enough to block out the hearthlight. He wore no crown, only a heavy mantle of black wolf fur over a tunic of boiled leather, his ancestral broadsword strapped to his back. His face was a landscape of harsh angles and old battle scars, but it was his eyes that paralyzed the room, a piercing, unnatural amber that missed absolutely nothing. Historically, the Alpha King never set foot in the kitchens. His domain was the Great Hall, the war room, and the training yards. His presence here was unprecedented, sending a jolt of primal terror through every servant and cook. Garrett Finch, his face pale and sweating, hobbled forward and dropped to his knees, pressing his forehead to the soot-stained flagstones. "My king," he stammered, his voice trembling. "To what do we owe the honor? The feast is nearly prepared." Cailan ignored him. The king was flanked by his commander of the guard, Lord Silas Thorne, but Cailan gestured for his men to stay back. The Alpha closed his eyes, his chest expanding as he took a slow, deep breath through his nose. He was filtering the complex odors of the room. Rosemary, charred bone, boiled wine, sweat, fear, and underneath it all, sharp and unmistakable, the tang of fresh, unhealed blood. Not animal blood. Pack blood. The scent of distress, carrying the bitter pheromones of an abused subordinate. To an Alpha whose paramount, instinctual duty was the protection of his pack, even the lowliest members, that scent was a glaring alarm bell. Cailan opened his eyes. His gaze bypassed the groveling head chef, bypassed the roasting meats, and landed directly in the darkest corner of the hearth. He locked on to Isolde. Isolde shrank back, pressing her small frame against the hot stones of the fireplace. She kept her chin tucked to her chest, her greasy hair falling forward to shield her battered face. She prayed to the moon goddess that the shadows would hide her. They didn't. The heavy, rhythmic thud of the king's boots echoed off the vaulted ceilings as he crossed the room. The crowd parted for him instinctively, leaving a wide, terrified path. Garrett Finch lifted his head, panic flaring in his eyes as he realized where the king was heading. "My lord, please. She is just a clumsy wretch, a dirty, unshifted mongrel." Cailan stopped in front of Isolde. He towered over her, his presence suffocatingly powerful. The ambient temperature around him seemed to drop. "Stand up!" Cailan commanded. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a deep, rumbling resonance that vibrated in Isolde's chest. It was an Alpha command. Her body obeyed before her mind could protest. Isolde struggled to her feet, swaying slightly as her bruised ribs screamed in protest. She kept her head bowed, staring at the scuffed leather of the king's boots. "Look at me." Trembling, Isolde slowly raised her head. The firelight caught the horrific swelling of her face, the dark, purple contusions masking her delicate features. A collective gasp rippled through the royal guard standing by the doorway. Cailan's expression remained carved in stone, but a dangerous, low growl began to vibrate in his throat. It was a sound that promised extreme violence. He reached out with a massive, calloused hand. Isolde flinched, bracing for a strike. Instead, his long fingers gently grasped her right wrist. With deliberate care, he pushed up the coarse wool sleeve of her tunic. The bruises on her arm were horrific, shaped perfectly, like the heavy iron tongs used to stoke the fires. But worse were the older, fading marks, cigarette burns, the faint, silvery scars of a leather strap, a roadmap of prolonged, systemic torture. The kitchen was so silent you could hear the ash settling in the hearth. Cailan gently lowered her arm. He didn't look at Garrett Finch. He didn't yell. He turned his head slightly toward his commander. "Silas," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "The feast will be served in exactly 1 hour. See that this girl is washed, given proper garments, and brought to the great hall." "My king?" Silas asked, momentarily confused by the bizarre order. Cailan's amber eyes finally snapped to the head chef, who was now trembling so violently his teeth chattered. "And bring the chef. He will serve my table personally tonight." Without another word, Cailan Blackwood turned and strode out of the kitchen, leaving a suffocating atmosphere of impending doom in his wake. The great hall of Oakhaven was a spectacle of medieval opulence. Massive iron chandeliers hanging from the vaulted ceilings bathed the room in a warm, flickering glow. Tapestries depicting the bloody history of the Blackwood lineage hung on the stone walls, insulating the room against the howling winter wind outside. The long oak tables were packed with visiting dignitaries, lesser lords and pack elites, all dressed in velvet, fur, and finely polished armor. At the head of the room sat the high table, elevated on a dais. Alpha King Cailan sat in the center, a heavy goblet of spiced wine untouched before him. To his right sat Lord Hastings of the Riverlands, a pompous, wealthy alpha who controlled the southern trade routes. Hastings was holding court, laughing loudly and boasting about his recent subjugation of rogue wolf factions near the border. Cailan was outwardly composed, but internally the beast beneath his skin was clawing at its cage. The scent of the little cook's blood had awakened something ancient and fiercely protective within him. It wasn't just the sheer brutality of her injuries that enraged him. It was the realization of his own blindness. He had been so consumed by border wars and political treaties that a rot had taken hold in the very foundation of his home. The heavy doors of the great hall groaned open, and the first course of the feast was paraded in. But the usual grand procession of servants was disrupted. Escorted by 2 heavily armed royal guards, Isolde Mercer walked into the great hall. The noise in the room died a sudden, unnatural death. The lords and ladies halted their conversations, their wine glasses suspended in mid-air. Isolde had been hastily scrubbed clean, her dark hair pulled back. They had given her a simple, clean linen dress, a servant's garb, but free of soot and grease. However, the clean face and neat clothes only highlighted the horrific damage done to her. In the bright light of the chandeliers, the purple and black bruising on her face looked even more grotesque. She walked with a noticeable limp, clutching her ribs. Behind her, flanked by more guards, stumbled Garrett Finch. The head chef was sweating profusely, carrying a massive silver platter of roasted boar. Lord Hastings frowned, leaning toward Cailan. "By the gods, Cailan, what is the meaning of this? Why is this battered wretch parading through the hall? It is ruining the appetite of my court." Cailan stood up slowly. The scrape of his heavy wooden chair against the stone floor echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "Bring the platter to the high table, Finch," Cailan commanded. Finch, his knees knocking, hurried forward and set the heavy silver platter down. He bowed so low, his nose nearly touched the table. Cailan then looked at Isolde. "Come here, girl." Isolde, terrified and shaking, climbed the steps of the dais. She stood before the Alpha King, entirely exposed to the scrutinizing, disgusted stares of the nobility. "Pour my wine," Cailan instructed softly. Isolde reached for the heavy silver pitcher. Because of her injured ribs and the deep bruising on her right arm, her grip was weak. As she lifted the pitcher, her arm gave out. The heavy silver vessel crashed onto the table, sending a river of dark red wine spilling across the crisp white linen, splashing directly onto Lord Hastings' velvet lap. Hastings erupted. "You incompetent little mongrel!" he roared, backhanding Isolde across her unbruised cheek. The force of the blow sent her crashing to the stone floor. Before Hastings could even lower his hand, Cailan moved. With speed impossible for a man of his size, the Alpha King vaulted the table. He grabbed Lord Hastings by the throat and slammed him backward onto the stone floor. The sound of cracking stone and breaking wood filled the air as Hastings' chair shattered beneath them. The entire hall erupted in shouts. Swords were drawn. Hastings' guards surged forward, but Cailan's men, led by Commander Silas, formed an instant wall of steel, their blades leveled at the visiting delegation. "Silence!" Cailan roared. It was a true Alpha command, laced with the raw, primal power of his bloodline. The sheer force of the sound brought every wolf in the room to their knees, their inner beasts submitting to the apex predator in the room. Cailan knelt beside Hastings, his massive hand still wrapped tightly around the Lord's throat. "You strike what is mine in my own hall?" Cailan hissed, his amber eyes glowing with an ethereal light. "She is a defect, a clumsy servant." Hastings choked out, his face turning purple. Kaelin stood, leaving Hastings gasping on the floor. He walked over to where Isolde lay trembling on the stones. He knelt, ignoring the gasps of his court, and gently scooped the girl into his arms, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. He carried her to his own chair at the center of the high table and sat her down in it. The symbolism was staggering. An unshifted, battered scullery maid sitting in the seat of the Alpha King. Kaelin turned to face the terrified crowd. "For 5 years," he began, his voice dropping to a dangerous, conversational tone that carried to the furthest corners of the hall. "I have heard whispers of missing orphans, of unshifted wolves disappearing from the lower wards. I was told it was the winter sickness. I was told they ran away to the human cities." He walked slowly toward Garrett Finch, who was now sobbing on the floor. "Tonight I found this girl in my kitchens," Kaelin continued. "She was beaten half to death to silence her." Kaelin reached down, grabbed Finch by his greasy hair, and yanked his head back. "Tell them, Finch. Tell them why you broke her ribs. Tell them what she saw you doing by the grain silos last night." Finch babbled, a mix of tears and snot running down his face. "Mercy, my king. I was forced. They threatened my life. It was Lord Hastings' men. They used the unshifted ones for the underground fighting pits in the Riverlands. I was just the broker. I swear it." A collective gasp of horror and outrage swept through the room. The buying and selling of pack members, even unshifted ones, for blood sport was the highest treason under the Silverpine Accords. Lord Hastings, scrambling to his feet, drew his dagger. "It's a lie. The word of a crippled cook and a defective maid." "The cook's word means nothing," Kaelin agreed coldly. He let go of Finch. He looked back at Isolde. She was staring at him, her one good eye wide with a mixture of terror and awe. Kaelin drew his ancestral broadsword. The ring of the steel sang through the silent hall. "But the injuries on this girl's body speak volumes, and she is under my absolute protection. The rot in this kingdom ends tonight." Kaelin pointed his massive blade directly at Hastings. "Seal the doors. No one from the Riverland delegation leaves this hall alive." The slaughter that followed would be written about in the histories for centuries. But what silenced the town of Oakhaven wasn't the blood spilled that night. It was what happened the morning after. The great hall smelled of copper, spilled wine, and terror. When the heavy iron doors finally swung open to let the winter dawn inside, the Riverland delegation had been entirely dismantled. Those who had fought were dead. Those who had surrendered were stripped of their titles and thrown into the frozen dungeons below the Wormtooth Mountains. Through the chaos of the night, Alpha King Kaelin had not left Isolde's side. He had carried the battered scullery maid past the carnage and up the winding stone stairs to the royal wing, a place strictly forbidden to anyone below the rank of a lord. Isolde awoke 2 days later, in a bed softer than anything she had ever touched, wrapped in thick furs and clean linen. The scent of pine and burning sandalwood filled the air. As she shifted, a sharp pain radiated through her ribs, but the agonizing throb in her face had dulled. "Do not move too quickly, child," a gentle, gravelly voice instructed. Sitting by the hearth was Nathaniel Reed, the royal healer. He was an older man with kind, tired eyes, carefully grinding herbs in a stone mortar. 3 cracked ribs, a fractured cheekbone, and severe malnourishment, Nathaniel listed quietly, not looking up from his work. "You are lucky the king possesses the sight he does. A few more days with Garrett Finch, and you would have been tossed into the incinerator like the rest of the ash." The king," Isolde rasped, her throat dry and raw. The memories of the great hall flooded back, the spilling of the wine, Lord Hastings' violent strike, and the terrifying, awe-inspiring wrath of Kaelin Blackwood. Why did he save me? I am unshifted. I am nothing. You are not nothing. A deep voice rumbled from the doorway. Calen stepped into the chamber. He had shed his heavy armor and wore a simple tunic of dark wool, but his presence still dominated the room. Nathaniel immediately stood and bowed before excusing himself, leaving the king and the cook alone in the quiet chamber. Calen pulled a wooden chair to the edge of the bed and sat. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. The violent swelling around her eye had receded slightly, revealing a striking, intelligent hazel eye that stared back at him with a mixture of terror and defiance. I have spent the last 48 hours interrogating Finch and the surviving Riverland guards, Calen said, his tone devoid of the monstrous rage he had shown in the hall. The corruption ran deep. They were skimming grain taxes, selling weapons to human bandits, and trafficking the unshifted orphans of my pack. But there are missing pieces. Ledgers that Finch claims were burned. Isolde swallowed hard, pulling the fur blanket tightly up to her chin. The silence stretched between them, thick with unsaid words. Then, slowly, the terrified scullery maid made a decision that would change the course of history. They weren't burned, Isolde whispered. Calen's amber eyes narrowed slightly. Explain. Finch couldn't read well, Isolde said, her voice trembling but gaining strength. He trusted a merchant from the high crags to keep the books. But I listened. When I was scrubbing the floors beneath his office grate, I heard every number, every name. She pointed a bruised finger to her temple. The ledgers are here, my king. I have a photographic memory for numbers. I know exactly how much silver he took on the 4th of October. I know the names of the children they sold. Little Benjamin, Clara's brother, Thomas, Abigail from the lower mills. Calen stared at her, completely stunned. The pack had always dismissed the unshifted as defective, assuming their lack of a wolf form meant a lack of worth. Yet here was a 19-year-old girl, beaten and starved, who had silently weaponized her mind while on her hands and knees in the ash. Before Calen could respond, the heavy oak door creaked open. Lady Beatrice Montgomery, a high-ranking noblewoman of the Blackwood court, swept into the room without an invitation. Clad in emerald velvet, Beatrice had long considered herself the front-runner to become Calen's Luna. Her eyes instantly darted to Isolde with poorly concealed disgust. "My king!" Beatrice said, her voice dripping with false concern. "The town is in an uproar. Whispers are spreading that you have lost your senses, starting a war with the Riverlands over a dirty scullery maid. Magistrate Harrison Sterling is demanding an assembly in the town square tomorrow to restore order. You cannot harbor this creature in the royal wing. It makes you look weak." Calen didn't even turn to look at Beatrice. He kept his eyes locked on Isolde's. "Let them whisper," he said softly, speaking only to the bruised girl in his bed. "Tomorrow, we will give them something to shout about." The winter sun hung low and pale over the grand square of Oakhaven. The entire town, from the highest-ranking lichen lords to the lowliest human merchants, had gathered in the freezing courtyard. A wooden scaffold had been erected in the center, not for an execution, but for a public tribunal. Magistrate Harrison Sterling, a stern man with a silver beard, stood at the podium, trying to maintain order among the restless, murmuring crowd. The political foundation of the kingdom was shaking. Whispers of Calen's madness had been fanned all night by Lady Beatrice and her loyalists, who stood near the front of the crowd, wrapped in thick fox furs and looking smug. When the royal horns sounded, the crowd parted. Alpha King Calen Blackwood walked into the square. But he did not walk alone. Beside him walked Isolde Mercer. She wore no servant's rags today. Calen had ordered her dressed in a heavy gown of midnight blue wool. A cloak of black fur draped over her slender shoulders. Her face was still fiercely bruised, a mosaic of dark purple and yellow, and she walked with a distinct limp. But she did not keep her head bowed. Guided by Kaelin's steady hand at the small of her back, she walked with a quiet, terrifying dignity. The town fell utterly silent. The sheer audacity of bringing an unshifted cook to a royal tribunal was unheard of. Garrett Finch was dragged out in heavy iron chains, thrown to his knees at the base of the scaffold. He looked pathetic, stripped of his kitchen kingdom, shivering in the cold. Magistrate Sterling cleared his throat. "My king, we are here to document the treasons of Garrett Finch, but without written proof of the trafficking ring, under the Silver Pine Accords, we can only charge him with localized theft." Lady Beatrice stepped forward, raising her voice for the crowd. "We cannot tear apart our alliances over the delusions of a traumatized maid. Send the girl away, execute the cook for stealing, and let us rebuild our trade with the Riverlands." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the nobility. Kaelin stepped back and simply gestured to the podium. "The Crown calls its primary witness." Isolde climbed the wooden steps. She gripped the edges of the podium, looking out over the sea of faces, wolves who had ignored her existence, guards who had kicked dirt on her, nobles who wore the silk bought with stolen pack silver. She took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her bruised ribs. "On the eve of the harvest moon," Isolde's voice rang out, remarkably clear and steady in the crisp winter air. "Garrett Finch loaded 4 wagons of royal grain. He recorded it as rot and ordered it burned. But at midnight, he sold it to Lord Hastings' men for 300 pieces of silver. The transaction was overseen by a mercenary named Silas." Finch gasped, his eyes wide with horror. 2 weeks later," Isolde continued, her voice growing louder, carrying a cadence of undeniable authority. 6 unshifted children were taken from the lower wards. Finch was paid 50 gold pieces per child. He hid the gold in a hollowed stone beneath the main hearth, directly under the 3rd iron spit. Magistrate Sterling signalled his guards. "Go to the kitchens. Check the hearth." The crowd waited in breathless tension. 10 minutes later, 2 guards returned at a sprint, carrying a heavy leather sack. They dumped it on the snow before the magistrate. A cascade of glittering gold coins spilled out. Pandemonium erupted. The lower classes, whose children had gone missing, surged forward with furious cries. The nobility looked on in stunned silence. Isolde did not stop. For the next hour, she stood at the podium and verbally dismantled an entire shadow network of treason, reciting dates, names, weights, and locations with flawless, chilling precision. She exposed 2 of the king's own councilmen, a dozen border guards, and Lady Beatrice's own cousin as conspirators in the trafficking ring. She wasn't a victim seeking pity. She was an architect of justice, wielding her mind like a broadsword. When she finally finished, she stepped back, exhausted, trembling from the cold and the pain. The town of Oakhaven was completely, utterly silenced. No one dared whisper about her being a mongrel or a defect. They looked at her with awe. Kaelin walked up the steps of the scaffold. He didn't look at the crowd, he looked only at Isolde. He reached out and gently traced the edge of the darkest bruise on her cheekbone. "You survived the ash," Kaelin murmured, his voice loud enough for the quiet square to hear. "And you carried my kingdom's salvation in your mind, while my enemies broke your bones." He turned to the crowd, his amber eyes blazing with an intensity that made the bravest warriors look away. He took Isolde's scarred, blistered hand in his massive one and raised it high. "The old laws are dead," Kaelin's voice thundered, echoing off the stone walls of the fortress. "No longer will strength be measured only by fangs and claws. No longer will the unshifted be cast aside into the shadows. Let this be known across every territory, every mountain, and every border." Lady Beatrice, pale and shaking, fell to her knees in the snow. Kaelin looked down at Isolde, a rare, breathtaking smile touching the corner of his lips. "I do not take this woman as my Luna because the fates decreed it, or because of ancient magic," the Alpha King declared, shattering centuries of tradition. "I take her because she is the bravest soul in this kingdom. She is Isolde Blackwood, and anyone who disrespects her will answer to my blade." The silence in the town of Oakhaven was absolute. It was a silence born not of fear, but of an earth-shattering paradigm shift. In a single morning, an abused scullery maid had not only destroyed a corrupt dynasty, but had fundamentally rewritten the laws of the Lycan world. The tale of Kaelin and Isolde rewrote the history of Oakhaven. It proved that true power does not reside in fangs or pure blood lineage, but in the courage to speak the truth when broken. The Alpha King did not just save a battered scullery maid, she saved his kingdom from rotting within. Together, they ruled an era defined not by fear, but by absolute, unwavering justice.